All right, again, praising God for his love. Let's call this chapter Real Love, understanding that even as we grow old and mature, we can have a tendency or the temptation to idealize love into something that it is actually not. And likewise, with God's love, our temptation can be sometimes even more to idealize his love into something it's not. But this chapter seems to give us a more practical, accurate picture of the way God describes his own love in his relation with Israel, as chapter 11 is going to begin. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. A relatively famous passage that gets into some more less famous details of what his love actually looks like, because by the time we get to verse 2, he's going to say, however, the more he tried in terms of calling to his son Israel, the more they resisted. Going on to describe what his love actually looked like in verse 3, he's going to continue. He taught Ephraim, as we've said, another word for Israel, or a dominant tribe within Israel. He taught them to walk. He took them up by their arms, healed them when they were ill or not well, with kindness and love. Not just going through the motions, but with some compassion, as one who eased their burdens. However, it wasn't enough. Therefore, he seems to, by the time we get to verse 5, talk about the way that he let go, allowing them to experience the consequences of their actions, taking them back to something that seems like Egyptian captivity, just with the Assyrians as their captors, and not like ones who simply get to surrender. The captivity he is bringing to Israel is going to go through the sword. And so it's going to go through that kind of anguish or the torment of the sword, as we've seen described in other prophets. Ideally, or specifically, as we mentioned, Isaiah is more of a contemporary of Hosea. But going on, he is going to talk about the way that their folly or their ways are going to lead them into some places where they will want to call out to God, but he is going to recall the days that he called out to them and they wouldn't answer. And likewise, they're going to find themselves in a period of time, much like we have seen throughout the prophecies. Matter of fact, we're going to see it in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in the Proverbs, and pointing forward, we'll see it again in Zechariah, where this is a low-key recurrent theme, the way in which God called out to them in a season where he was available, but he is now not willing to listen in much the same way they didn't listen in those years or those era. Going on, though, he is going to say in verse 8, however, how can he give them up to the destruction that he brought to places like Admah and Zeboim, places I did not recognize, but in a quick search was able to realize that they are the lesser named, I guess, contemporaries or neighbors of Sodom and Gomorrah, places he completely annihilated, as he's going to say at least in one portion of, I think it's Deuteronomy, when he's describing the level of destruction brought to Sodom and Gomorrah. He is saying to Israel, his people, that understand he will bring that same level of destruction to them, the kind of destruction he brought to Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, and Admah, if they walk the same path. Understanding that, though, that is where the upside of real love comes in, reminding us of why David, when given 3 choices of penalties he could suffer for the unlawful senses, chose the one that put him in the hands of God, because God's real love comes with real mercy. And that is one of the things we'll see here in Hosea. But moving forward, he is going to say in verse 9, he will not execute his burning anger against them. Going on in verse 10 to say, after a while, they will actually come after the Lord, describing the way that they will return, understanding that even though they could follow God with joy, it's going to be a return that comes with trembling. In verse 11, he is going to talk about the things that brought them into this circumstance, understanding the way that, verse 12 is going to say, they surrounded him with lies and deceit in an environment he is trying to establish and fill with peace. There are times, however, when we can become so preoccupied by our freedom to say whatever we want that we lose track of the ways in which not telling the truth or spinning the truth can destabilize the ability for people to trust one another. And in an environment where trust is lacking, it's going to be tough to have peace. But understanding that, he's going to say the bright line, at least at this point, is that Judah is still walking with God, faithful to the Holy One. And even though that is going to change in about 100 years, for now, we're getting to see a living example of the way that God says he will give each according to their ways. This chapter reminding me, however, that even though that each according to his ways, reap what you sow. Fundamental is a part of God's love that we cannot wish away with an exaggerated view or emphasis on grace that doesn't fully prepare us for all of the things that God has allowed his people and will continue to allow his people to endure. Grace and mercy are still a very real component of the way that God loves his people, even at their worst. Understanding that going back to the Deuteronomy warnings that he gave his people about Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, God promised to absolutely destroy them when they got to this point. But he's talking about, as we saw in verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? And even at a point at which he promised they could look forward to total destruction, he's saying he just won't. Which doesn't mean that he would not hand them over to the difficult days ahead. History shows how bad it was about to get for Israel. But it does help us understand that, as we've mentioned, even at their worst, God was willing to cut his people's suffering short. And as we have a number of families going through difficulty and loss right now, a note from a sister this week reminded me that as difficult as things get, God can still weave real signs of mercy even into our days of difficulty, reminding me of why we sometimes get in the habit of saying, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May God help us see evidence, clear signs of his mercy, even in our days of difficulty.